Russia announces that it has officially incorporated 4 regions of Ukraine. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. Russian President Vladimir Putin signed legislation on Wednesday to officially claim regions of eastern and southern Ukraine as part of Russia. The Kremlin says it's liberating people there after a Moscow-led referendum produced a majority vote in favor of joining the Russian Federation. Ukrainian officials reject the move and say that vote was a complete sham. CGTN Stuart Smith reports from Moscow.
After announcing voting just 2 weeks ago, with fighting still ongoing, Vladimir Putin has split Ukraine. These residents of regions now taken over by Russia have found themselves trapped on the other side. They want to return home from territory controlled by Ukraine to territory controlled by Russia, but they say Ukrainian authorities won't let them, citing safety concerns. Under laws signed off in Moscow, Russia automatically considers them citizens. The Kremlin says it's recognizing the whole of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions as Russian, while only parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia. But there's no map that can be found that shows which parts. The Kremlin says it's responsible for all the territory that the armed forces controlled at the end of September, when President Putin signed the decree. But already Ukraine's armed forces have taken back some of that territory. The Kremlin says it's Russian territory that will eventually be retaken. Those that spoke to us in Moscow are saying this is a good move.
I absolutely understand and support all of this. And those 80 to 100,000 outcasts who have fled, we don't care about them.
And like in sports, Team Russia has made a substitution. Roughly 2 million out, 5 million more in. It's great if people made their choice. Why not? It's a great thing.
Russia has always said what it calls a special military operation is neither a war nor an occupation. By the end of 2022, Moscow says the regions that have been taken over will be using the Russian ruble, and Russian vehicle registration plates have been assigned. But these people are caught up in the changes on the ground. Stuart Smith, CGTN, Moscow.
There is lots to discuss. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Rhode Island, Vladimir Goldstein is chair of the Department of Slavic Studies at Brown University. From London, we have Alexander Claxon. He is a researcher at Lancaster University. Here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University. And from Kyiv, we have Yulia Mendel. She is the former press secretary for Volodymyr Zelensky and author of the book, The Fight of Our Lives. Welcome to all of you. Yulia, Russia has taken over 4 Ukrainian regions, the regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, and incorporated them into the Russian Federation. And Russia has also issued a warning that any attack by Ukraine in this particular part of Ukraine will be considered an attack on Russia itself. So how is Ukraine going to respond to this?
Well, that's an interesting point of view, because as we know that the whole world, civilized world, Western world, did not recognize this kind of annexation. So in fact, it's absolutely illegal annexation of Ukrainian territory. And besides that, Kremlin was very clear about the fact that they even do not know by themselves where the borders of the territories that they try to claim as Russian territories are. In fact, even those territories that used to be under Russian occupation, and Ukraine clearly states that this is occupation, were at the moment when these so-called documents were signed. Ukraine has liberated and retaken them back, and we can see clearly this on the maps. So Ukraine, as the Western world, as well as Turkey, and as well as many other countries, do not recognize any kind of taking of Ukrainian territories by Russia. In fact, we call it war, we call it invasion, and we know that many people suffer. Kherson is my home region. I talk a lot to people there. They suffer, and they pray so that Ukrainian army comes to Kherson as fast as possible.
Right, Yulia, I get your point about nobody recognizing these incorporated regions into the Russian Federation, but we do have these facts on the ground right now, and how is Ukraine going to respond to it?
Ukraine is retaking our territories back, and we are having very successful counteroffensives. Recently, we have returned many settlements in the northern east of the country, in the east of the country, and south of the country. Even today, we have retaken back 3 settlements in Kherson region and at least 6 settlements in Luhansk region. We see that Russian army is very demoralized, and it's taken back for the reason that they don't have any motivation to come and invade another country. For you to understand, this is real war. They came and invaded our country. They just tried to steal our land, and they killed tens and thousands of Ukrainians. This is terrible thing what they are doing. We find mass graves. We find a lot of dead civilians who have been tortured under Russian occupation. We find even 5-year-old kids in the mass graves and torture cells. This is terrible what Russian army is doing in Ukraine.
Right.
And if they want to be serious about this, they just need to withdraw their troops out of our country.
Vladimir Goldstin, how does the Russian takeover of these 4 regions change the course of the conflict? Could we see a major escalation, or could we see at some stage these 4 territories and their incorporation being used as some kind of negotiating tactic?
Well, it's a complex question. I don't think these 4 territories will be used for negotiation tactics. I think they will be in Russia. And I want to stress that Russia is in this for the long stretch. They are very serious. For 8 years, Russian public seen how people living in the east of Ukraine, primarily in these territories, which are now part of Russia, being shelled by Ukrainian forces, mistreated, declared second-rate. So the mood in the country is not what Yulia suggests. Many people actually want that to sort of, remain in Russia, and people who they have relatives there and friends, and they speak the same language, to be protected. So, and Russia is not going to, give up. The very idea that these 4 republics became now part of Russia is very important from the Russian perspective. The West might not recognize it, but it actually plays into Russian hands, because Russians are saying the West is against us. This is a proxy war. They're fighting us, and we have to fight back. And now we're fighting not in Ukraine, not invading or anything. We're fighting and defending our territories. So that's what Russia do. And temporary setbacks, if the country of the size and the potential like Russia really decide to do it seriously, Ukraine cannot win. So they really have to sit down and negotiate rather than going around the world pointing fingers in Russia, demanding more and more, help for rather kind of bloody war, which they cannot win. So that's the result. How it will end up later on, I don't know. But these republics are definitely staying within Russia.
Anton Fedyashin, what is your assessment of what this takeover means? I mean, we saw President Putin sign those documents that incorporate these 4 regions into Russia. And if we look back to February, when this part of the conflict took that turn on February 24th, President Putin did not say that this was one of his intentions. I mean, his motivation was driven by the fact, he told us, to disarm Ukraine, to denazify Ukraine, and to make sure that Ukraine would be a neutral state, would not join NATO. But now we have this takeover.
Right. So, first of all, I think it's important, Anand, to distinguish between the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine and Kherson and the part of Zaporozhye region. I think the original intent of the Kremlin was to definitely push the Ukrainian army out of the Donbas region. But I don't think that beyond that, there was much of a firm plan. There were probably many scenarios, as all governments and militaries have. But I think that the breakdown of the peace talks in Istanbul and the repeated refusal of the Ukrainian side to entertain any chance of renewed negotiations. Vladimir Zelensky, Mikhail Podolyak, and Alexei Arestovich, his two closest advisors, as well as the Ukrainian military, were in the public saying this over and over again over the past few months. I think that's what pushed the Russians to make this gamble about Zaporozhye and Kherson. Listen, I think it's a given that the overwhelming majority of the international community will simply not recognize this. But look, we've got historical precedents of this. When the Soviet Union occupied the three Baltic independent states in 1940 and incorporated them into the USSR. The United States, for example, did not de jure legally recognize the three by then Soviet republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, as part of the Soviet Union, and yet it treated them as de facto parts of that. We have Kosovo, which is an unrecognized state. It's not a member of the United States, and it exists on its own. I don't think the Russians care terribly much about international recognition, but that, of course, comes with risks. But look, they don't have to, these areas don't have to entertain foreign embassies. They will not be seeking membership in international organizations or in the UN. So the international angle of this sort of falls to the side. What the Kremlin has to do is actually take control of these regions. As Yulia mentioned correctly, so far over the past week and a half, the trend has been going in the opposite direction. And Russian support for this war and for this action will be conditional on how well the mobilized Russian forces do over the next several weeks and months.
One other quick point, Anton. President Putin also signed a decree taking Russian federal ownership of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I mean, how significant is that?
Well, I don't think it's going to change anything on the ground. It is still on the front line. It's just south of the Kakhovka Reservoir. It's still susceptible to shelling from the Ukrainian side. It's still a risk. The only thing that this changes is that it will now be formally run by Rosatom, which is the official federal atomic agency in Russia. But in terms of the geopolitical value of the power plant, not much will change, nor will the risks, by the way.
Alexander Clarkson, what is your view on these developments in the conflict right now? Matt, firstly, do you believe that these territories will remain part of Russia? And if they do, I mean, how much of a setback is that to any kind of future peace settlement? I mean, what Russia is asking for here is for Ukraine to give up a huge chunk of its territory.
Well, Vladimir Putin's political survival depends on Russia keeping these territories. He made it very clear in his speech that these territories will remain part of Russia. Now, if he was to give up any of those regions, whether in whole or in part, whether through successful Ukrainian military operations or through negotiations, that would be considered a massive failure on Russia's part. And I don't think that the Russian population would approve of such a move by Putin. And I think his inner circle would also view it as a massive failure if Russia had to give up on these regions. For that reason, I think that from Vladimir Putin's point of view, these regions will stay part of Russia. Now, that creates a very challenging situation because essentially we have two competing sides, obviously Russia and Ukraine, that are saying that these regions belong to them and only to them. I think Vladimir Putin is very much, capable of utilizing any means necessary to keep these regions part of Russia. And I'm, of course, talking about nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not going to go as far as saying that he's already decided that he will use them, but I think it's very much an option for him to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. It's a very obviously disconcerting thought, and it's a very frightening thought. But as I said, his political survival depends on this. If he were to lose these regions, I think there is a very high chance that he would be essentially kicked out from the Kremlin, whether through a palace coup, so essentially an elite coup within the Kremlin, or by the people of Russia, particularly those kind of on the far right, the kind of the nationalistic side of Russia. So, and obviously that would mean that we don't know what would happen to him if he were to be removed from power.
Yeah.
So from our point of view, it's a very dangerous situation. I think Putin's willing to go all the way in this situation.
Yulia, what do you make of what's happening at this nuclear power plant? I mean, it's not very clear who controls it right now, and Ukraine depends to a significant amount on this power plant for its electricity needs. And what does it mean for Ukraine when Russia takes over civilian infrastructure of this kind?
Yeah, the thing is that Ukraine was showing a lot of videos, and they were recognized internationally that there are a lot of shelling from Russian side there. So, we can here fight Ukrainian or Russian side, but in fact, the most important thing that there is a lot of shelling there, and this is very dangerous situation. It's dangerous not only for Ukraine, it's the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. So if there is a nuclear threat from there, if there is a disaster, then it will be much bigger than Chernobyl, and many, many countries will suffer, including Russia. And so the international community asks Russia to to withdraw its troops so that there is no military conflict there. Right now, any documents that are signed don't make any changes on the ground for the reason that these documents, first of all, are not recognized, and secondly, they don't change the situation at all.
Vladimir Goldstein, another big development on Tuesday. OPEC announced a 2 million barrel a day cut in oil production. Of course, this comes at a time when Europe is being battered by energy shortages, as well as massive increases in the price of energy. And if we look at the price of oil going up, of course, this is going to help Russia. And the two of the countries we know who were behind this were Russia and Saudi Arabia, this OPEC cut. And that comes after President Biden went to Saudi Arabia to plead with the Saudis to increase oil output. What does this mean for Europe?
Well, this is a significant event by itself, but also as an emblem. What Russians are doing, but they are forced to do, they involve also in economic warfare, not just military warfare. And economic warfare consists in a couple of things. We talk about atomic station. They feel that Ukraine is actually economically is a very failed state. So they depend on the handouts from the West. Their money collapses. People are sort of poor. They get in from more and more poor. What distracts their attention from dire straits of economy is the war, of course. But basically, the country is going down. The question is, with the price of oil going up, with the gas going up, with the shortages, for how long the West will support this failed economic entity? That's the question. So the very fact that prices of oil will be up, United States is going to have their midterm elections, in less than a month, and I'm sure that Americans will be voting their pockets, and they would. Americans and British and many others, they would say for how long this war should go on, for how long we should take our money, good money, and pay them for bad money. So that's a part. That's what sort of Russians are. Who prove themselves to be economically rather strong despite the sanctions. That's what they hope to accomplish. So it's not just the very fact that oil will go like $2 more and Russia will make $2 more on something, but it's a major pressure on Europe to make Ukraine sit down and negotiate rather than be engaged in this war, which takes lives and destroys the economy.
Yeah, Anton Fedyashin, this OPEC cut comes in the wake of the bombing of that Nord Stream pipeline, and there is deep concern in Europe over these energy shortages. This is what the executive director of the International Energy Agency had to say. Let's listen.
So we should, in my view, increase our alert. We have to double our alert in terms of the security and the protection of the entire critical energy infrastructure of Europe, ranging from pipelines to our networks, from networks to our power plants. I think it's time to be very agile here.
Anton, how serious is this situation for Europe?
Oh, it's very serious, Anand. As a matter of fact, Europe's already approaching the deepest economic crisis that it has experienced since the end of the Second World War. Listen, inflation is going through the roof. In general, the inflation within the EU, in parts of the EU, such as in the Baltic countries, we're looking at 20% and above. The energy crisis is going to make things even worse. And one of the things that surprises me is that the leadership of the EU in Brussels is talking about putting a price cap on oil come this December, then in the beginning of next year, which is sure to make to turbocharge what is already a massive crisis. This is part of the problem when in some parts of the EU leadership and in some of the EU countries, you have activists running things instead of professional economists and sane politicians. You know, all of this makes European support for Ukraine that much more difficult. They didn't plan for this, obviously. Remember, there was a lot of talk at the beginning of the war in Ukraine that, you know, the Americans are going to come in with an armada of LNG tankers. Then the Saudis were going to come in, then Qatar and the UAE. Then there was all sorts of talk about Azerbaijan, by the way, then Nigeria. None of this has worked out because there is simply no replacement for Russian gas. And even if by some miracle there were an LNG replacement, it would be very, very expensive. Right. There's something that Europeans sort of tend to forget, unfortunately, which is that it was cheap Soviet and Russian gas that in large part contributed to Europe's remarkable economic growth from the 70s on. Yeah. And those days of cheap Russian energy sources looks like they're at an end.
Right. Alexander Klaxon, on this energy issue, what are we to make of the statement that was made by the United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken in the wake of that Nord Stream pipeline bombing? He said it presents, quote, tremendous opportunity for Europe to reduce its dependence on Russian energy supplies.
Well, that's obviously the best case scenario for the United States, but of course that will take quite a significant amount of time. Obviously, most of Europe used to get their gas from Russia, you know, so around 40%, 50% mark. And even though Norway has stepped in, and Europe is looking to get more gas from the likes of Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan and other countries as well, it will take a significant amount of time. I think Europe will manage this winter because the reserves are relatively full, sort of around 80%. So they will manage this winter with, you know, a few bruises here and there, perhaps a few blackouts. So it won't be completely smooth, but they will get through it. I think primarily what will happen is obviously there'll be a significant hit on the economic side rather than, let's say, people not having enough energy to heat their homes. The biggest issue for Europe going forward will be next year. You know, when those reserves run out, and if Russia doesn't obviously turn on the taps, that's when Europe will struggle. And I think we may see, especially particularly in countries in Central Europe, such as the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Bulgaria, we've already seen a few protests there, and the ruling governments there are struggling against the tide. And so we may see more opposition and, let's say, pro-Russian politicians becoming more popular in those countries. But they won't have enough, let's say, strength in the whole of the EU to make a significant policy change within the EU itself.
Right, Yulia, listening to what our guests are telling us there about the deep concern in Europe over energy supplies, the challenges that Europe faces, you know, as Anton Fedyashin told us a moment ago, this puts a question mark over European support for Ukraine. That must be of deep concern to Ukraine.
Well, let me remind you that today the European Union agreed the 8th package of sanctions against Moscow, despite all the energy blackmail that Russia does to Europeans. European economies, as well as the American economy, are much stronger than Russian economy and much, of course, stronger than Ukrainian economy. So, of course, they are looking for diversification of their energy resources than on being continuing to dependent on Russian country that actually behaves today as a terrorist country, even if it's not recognized as a terrorist country. And let me say that Vladimir so impudently say that Ukraine is a failed economic state. But in fact, if we look at Russia, let's not forget that Russians right now, many Russians, majority of Russians, they live in much worse conditions than even the poorest Ukrainians. And when we see that Russian army comes to Ukrainian homes stealing toilets and washing machines, this really makes us understand how much we achieved choosing the European
I think we have lost Julia there. Let me go to Vladimir Goldstin. Vladimir Goldstin, I want to get to one final development. We've got a little bit of time left. The New York Times, which often reflects the United States government thinking and opinion, is reporting that the U.S. believes Ukraine was behind the assassination of the journalist and political scientist Daria Dugina in Russia. What do you make of this?
I think it's very plausible. Unfortunately, what we don't hear in the West is this behavior of Ukraine, which is more or less geared toward intimidation, toward bullying, toward shelling, toward burning people as they did in Odessa protest in 2014, as shelling people in Donbass and so on. And intimidating. They created this government-sponsored hit list, on which they put people from musicians for Pink Floyd to 13-year-old girls who wrote something in Russian. So this is, Yulia mentioned this term, which is, terrorist state. I don't think Ukraine is there yet, but I think they are really heading there in view of their economy, in view of their total intolerance of people who speak Russian, who do something different. We've seen just recently, after they took over the city Liman, they began to harass everyone, arresting, interrogating people who just happen to take Russian medical help. That type of behavior, first of all, this type of behavior is reported in Russia. This type of behavior is very plausible. So I think, with the situations like that, we don't have...
Vladimir, I'm getting out of time here, and I want Yulia to have a chance to respond very quickly. Yulia, I've just got a few seconds left. Go ahead.
No, I just mean when we talk about Russian oppression in Ukraine, that doesn't make any sense because I'm from Russian-speaking region and I speak Russian and Ukrainian very well. Well, and Ukraine had the position about the article which was mentioned today. In fact, we don't think that Dugina was important enough to involve so much efforts to, create this assassination.
Okay.
And, this is a very logical issue, and we declined.
Yulia, I'm sorry we have run out of time. Sorry to cut you off there. We have run out of time. We have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.